Unit 21 Civil Society and Democracy. Contents 21.1 Introduction, 21.2 Civil Society a Retrospection, 21.3 Democracy a Universal Appeal, 21.4 The Scope of Civil Society, 21.5 Relationship between Civil Society and Democracy, 21.6 Functions of Civil Society in a Democratic Order, 21.7 Civil Society as a Promoter of Democracy, 21.8 The Democratic Dangers of Civil Society, 21.9 Conclusion, and 21.10 Further Reading. Learning Objectives. After you have read this unit, you will be able to explain what is civil society, outline the relationship between civil society and democracy, democratize of danger of civil society. 21.1 Introduction. In recent years, the concept like civil society and concern for democracy has gained much of the space in academic discussions, debates, and writings around the world. In the world of ideas, civil society is hot. It is almost impossible to read an article on foreign or domestic policy without coming across some mention on the concept. Though the terminology civil society and democracy is as old as a social science, is yet they have undergone radical change in its meaning and essence. For our understanding of the concept, it would be desirable to take a look at the historical perspective of this concept, where different intellectuals have placed their thoughts in their directions. 21.2 Civil Society a Retrospection. The rise in popularity of civil society was largely due to the struggles against tyranny waged by resistance groups in Latin America, Africa, and the former communist world. The period of 1980s and 1990s witnessed the advent of a global democratic revolution of unprecedented proportions. Unions, women's organizations, student groups, and other forms of popular activism provided the resurgent and often rebellious civil societies in triggering the demise of many forms of dictatorship. These developments encouraged the rise of the complex notion that if an invigorated civil society could force a democratic transition, it could consolidate democracy as well. The term civil society can be traced to the works of Cicero and other Romans to the ancient Greek philosophers. In its classical usage, civil society was largely equated with the state. The modern idea of civil society found expression in the Scottish and continental Enlightenment of the late 18th century. Here, a range of political philosophers from Thomas Paine to George Hegel developed the notion of civil society as a domain parallel to but separate from the state, where citizens associate according to their own interests and wishes. Hegel's 19th century notion of civil society included the market, in contrast to the contemporary concept of civil society as a non-profit sector. This new definition reflected changing economic realities, the rise of private property, market competitions, and bourgeoisie. It also resulted in the mounting popular demand for liberty as manifested in the American English and French revolutions. The term, however, lost its concurrence in the mid-19th century as political philosophers and sociologists turned their attention to the social and political consequences of the Industrial Revolution. It bounced back into a fashion after World War II, though the writings of the Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci, who revived the term to portray civil society as a special nucleus of the independent political activity, a crucial sphere of struggle against tyranny. Although Gramsci was concerned about the dictatorships of the right, his books was influenced in the 1970s and 80s amongst persons fighting against the dictatorships of all political strips in Eastern Europe and Latin America. Czech, Hungarian, and Polish activities also wrapped themselves in the banner of civil society, endowing it with a heroic quality when the Berlin Wall fell. Understanding the importance of the given concept, David Held tried to give shape to the concept of civil society through a sociological definition. In his words, civil society retains a distinct character to the extent that it is made up of areas of social life, the democratic world, the economic sphere, cultural activities, and political interaction, which are organized by a private or voluntary arrangements between individuals and groups outside the direct control of the state. Suddenly, in the 1990s, civil society became a mantra for everyone from presidents to political scientists. The global trend towards democracy opened up space for civil society in formerly dictatorial countries around the world. In the United States and Eastern Europe, public fatigue with tired party systems sparked intense interest in civil society as a means of social renewal, especially in the developing world. Privatization and other markets reforms offered civil society the change to step in as government retracted their reach, and the information revolution provided new tools for forging connections and empowering citizens. Civil society became a key element of the post-Cold War zeitgeist. 21.3 Democracy, a universal appeal. Like civil society, democracy has also been a fluid concept across the times and places. Sharp contrast could be visualized between ancient Athenian democracy and modern liberal democracy, representative democracy and deliberative democracy, national democracy and cosmopolitan democracy. Yet a common theme runs through all these conceptions of democracy, that it is a condition where a community of people exercise collective self-determination. Through democracy, members of a given public demos takes decisions that shape their destiny jointly with equal rights and opportunities of participation and without arbitrarily imposed constraints on debate. Given the paucity of space, it would be sufficient to say that the democracy is essentially participatory, consultative, transparent and publicly accountable. By one mechanism or another, democratic governance rests on the consents of the governed. Emphasis added, democracy is constructed in relation to the context and should be reconstructed when that context changes. The contemporary globalization constitutes the sort of change of situations that requires new approaches to democracy. According to Schmitter and Kahl, for purpose of clarity and consistency, modern political democracy is defined as a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens acting indirectly through the cooperation of their elected representatives. Before we attempt to make analysis of the relationship between civil society and democracy, how far they could be complementary or in promoting each other, it would be imperative to have a view of the overarching concept of civil society. 21.4 The scope of civil society. The much of the current enthusiasm about civil society is its fascinations with non-governmental organizations, especially advocacy groups devoted to public interest and causes, and its concern for environment, human rights, women issues, right of the disabled, election monitoring, anti-corruption, etc. Such groups have been on the increase in recent years, particularly in the countries under influence of democratic transitions. However, it would be a misconception to equate civil society with mere NGOs. Whereas civil society is a much broader concept encompassing all the organizations and associations that exist outside the state, including political parties and the market-oriented organization. It includes the plethora of organizations that political scientists traditionally label interest groups or pressure groups. Apart from NGOs, labor unions, professional associations such as those of doctors and lawyers, chambers of commerce, ethnic association and others, the list is all comprehensive. It also incorporates many other associations that exist for the purpose other than advancing specific social and political agendas, such as religious organizations, student groups, cultural organizations, sports club and informal community groups. Emphasis added, non-governmental organizations do play an important role in developed and developing countries. They help in formulating policies by exerting pressure on government and by finishing technical expertise and policy makers. They include citizen participation and civic education. They provide leadership training to young people who want to engage in civic life but are apathetic towards the political parties. In theocratic and dictatorial countries, NGOs are outweighed by more traditional parts of civil society. Religious organization, cultural organization, and other groups often they have a mass base in the population and secure domestic sources of funding. Here, advocacy groups usually lack domestic funding. The burgeoning NGO sectors in such or countries are often dominated by elite run by groups that have only weak ties with the citizens, and for their functioning they largely depend upon international funders for budgets they cannot nourish for domestic sources. Apart from these positive contours of civil society formation, it is worth pointing out that the mafia and militia groups are also as much as part of civil society as the other humane organizations are. Some civil society enthusiasts have propagated the one-sided notion that civil society consists only of noble causes and welfare action-oriented programs. Yet civil society everywhere is a mixture of the good, the bad, and the outright bizarre. A random surfing through web pages on the internet helps convey a sense of that diversity where one gets through the real scope of civil society. If one limits civil society to those actors who pursue higher humane aims, the concept becomes a theological notion, not a political or sociological one, which could injure the notion of society itself. 21.4 Relationship between civil society and democracy. It is emphasized here that in a certain condition, civil society can contribute to the democratization of authoritarian regimes and can help to sustain a democratic system of governance once it is established. For example, in the Eastern European countries, South Africa, Serbia, Philippines, and recently in Georgia, citizens have used civil society's organization to wage struggle for political independence by learning about democracy and by mobilizing millions of their fellow citizens against repressive regimes. In democratic setup, civil society organizations provide basis for citizens to pursue common interests in political, social, and spiritual domain. Here they participate freely, collectively, and peacefully. By their involvement in civil society, citizens learn about fundamental democratic values of participation and collective action, and they further disseminate these values within their communities. Civil society movements that represent citizen interests can considerably influence both government policy and social attitudes. Independent activities of the civil society can pose a counterweight to state power. Box 21.1 People's Power. The idea of civil society is largely associated in many Western minds with people power movements to oust dictators. The successful Western democracy program to strengthen the civil society in different parts of the world have become a standard agenda for US and European countries. It is also known as the Democracy Promotion Toolkit. Thomas Carothers and Marina Ottaway provide two interesting contributions to the discussion of the potential collaborative role of the international community and civil society in considering democracy. Aiding Democracy Abroad is one of the most comprehensive and important published work on current practices in US democracy promotion. Carothers, without going into the international relations debate or whether democracy promotion as a strategy corresponds to realist security interest or idealist humanitarian motivations, he claims that it is the blend of the two. To substantiate his viewpoint in a systematic manner, he discussed three central aspects of democracy aid: electoral assistance, institutional reform, and civil society assistance. He does this by elaborating on 4 case studies of countries on the receiving end of various types of US democracy assistance: Guatemala, Nepal, Zambia, and Romania. Democracy aid, in Carothers' view, is the byproduct of democratization, not the vice versa. The political space created by democratizing regimes have made it possible for international assistance to pursue democracy promotion in these countries. In his conclusive observation, he remarks that despite variation in local context, US democracy promotion activities follow a one-size-fits-all democratic template, which is not a healthy promotion scheme. This template of aiding democracy, he propounds, has developed in course of practice rather than by conscious application of academic theories. The strengthening of civil society in different parts of the world is frequently offered as the answer to the questions pervasive in Washington: how can the Arab world democratize, and what should the United States do to help democracy there? Though one cannot conquer US interference in the international affairs of any other country, yet there is a strong consensus among scholars that civil society is uppermost to the incarnation of democracy. John Kane expresses this view when he notes that where there is no civil society, there cannot be citizens with capabilities to choose their identities, entitlements, and duties within a political legal framework. 21.6 Functions of civil society in a democratic order. Throwing light about the functions of civil society in promoting democratic polity, Larry Diamond in his article Rethinking Civil Society in 1996 says civil society plays a significant role in building and consolidating democracy. He opines that democracy civil society, the more likely it is that democracy will emerge and endure. These endure. In Diamond's view, civil society prefers following important functions. 1. To limit state power by checking its political abuses and violation of the law and subjecting them to public scrutiny. Diamond maintains a vibrant civil society is probably more essential for consolidating and maintaining democracy than initiating it. Second, to empower citizens by increasing the political efficacy and skill of the democratic citizens and promoting an appreciation of obligation as well as rights of democratic citizenship. Third, to inculcate and promote an arena for the development of democratic attributes among the citizens such as tolerance, moderation, a willingness to compromise, and respect for opposing viewpoints. According to Diamond, this is an important function as it allows traditionally excluded groups such as women and racial or ethnic minorities access to power that has been denied them in the upper echelons of formal politics. 4. To provide avenues for political parties and other organizations, allowing them to articulate, aggregate, and represent their interests. This enhances the quality of democracy as it generates opportunities for participation and influences all levels of governance, not the least the local government. 5th, to function as a recruiting, informational, and leadership generating agency, especially in economically developed societies where economic reforms is sometimes necessary but often difficult to bring about it if it is threatened vested economic interest. The massive economic collapse in Indonesia unleashed mass discontent and made President Suharto suddenly vulnerable. This transformed the environment to allow civil societies groups and opposition parties to mobilize citizens in an unprecedented fashion. 6. A well-founded civil society could act as a shock observing institutions where wide range of interests that may cross-cut and mitigate the principal priorities of political conflict. 7. To generate public and political support for successful economic and political reforms which require the support of coalition in society and the legislator. 8. A well-rooted civil society also helps in identifying and train new political leaders. As such, it can play a crucial role in revitalizing the narrow and stagnant party-dominated leadership recruitment patterns. 9th, election monitoring. Many non-partisan organizations engage in election monitoring at home and abroad. Such efforts, say Diamond, have been critical in detecting the fraud, enhancing voter confidence, affirming the legitimacy of the result, or demonstrating an opposition victory despite government fraud. The Philippines in the mid of 1980s and Panama in 1989 are cited as examples. Strengthening citizens' attitudes towards the state, civil society enhances the accountability, responsiveness, inclusiveness, effectiveness, and hence legitimacy of the political system. In so doing, it gives citizens respect for the state and positive involvement in it. Hence, civil society is crucial to the development and maintenance of stable, quality, sensitive democracy. 10th, in addition to this, other scholars have also come out with their viewpoint on the subject, borrowing from Robert Dell's classic work on democracy. Alfred Stefan, in his work Problems of Democratic Transition and Consolidation, states that among the basic requirements for democracy is the opportunity to formulate preferences to signify preferences and to have these preferences weighed adequately in the conduct of government. According to Robert Dahl, for the proper functioning of government, it should ensure the following institutional guarantees, which includes freedom of association, expression, the right to vote, run for public office, free and fair election, the right of political leaders to compete for support and votes, alternative source of information, policy making institution depend on votes, other expressions of preference. Box 21.2 Fundamental Liberties. However, while accepting the importance of these institutional guarantees, Stephen considers them as a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the functioning of democracy. Not sufficient because no matter how free and fair the elections and no matter how large the majority of the government, the political society lacks quality unless it is able to produce a constitution that provides for fundamental liberties, minority rights, and a set of institutions and checks and balances that limit state power and ensure accountability necessary for any given democratic system. 21.7 Civil Society as a Promoter of Democracy. In an article, Civil Society and Democracy in Global Governance, Dr. Jan Arad Shorte makes a comprehensive analysis of the concept. She not only visualizes positive aspects of the relationship between the civil society and democracy, but also evaluates the enthusiastic side of it too. Taking a positive note of the civil society as promoter of democratic form of governance, Schulte identifies 6 areas where civil society could advance democracy. 1. Public education. Awareness is a key to any democratic system. The civil society might enhance democracy through educating the public. An informed citizenry could sustain an effective democracy. Civic associations can contribute a lot by raising public awareness and understanding of worldwide existing laws and regulatory institutions. To accomplish this goal, civil societies groups can prepare handbooks and information kits, produce audio, video, visual presentation, organic workshops, circulate networks, newsletters, supply information to and attract the attention of the mass media, maintain websites on the internet, and develop circular materials for schools and institutions of higher education. 2. Voice to stakeholders. Civil society could promote democratic governance by giving voice to stakeholders. Civic associations can opportune the concerned parties to relay information, testimonials, and analyze to the governance agencies about their needs and demands. Civil society organizations give voice to the neglected social circles like the poor, women, and persons with disability who tends to get a limited hearing through other channels, including their elected representative in executive and legislative bodies. In this way, civic activism could empower stakeholders and mold politics towards greater participatory democracy. 4. Policy inputs. Government policy formulation is considerably influenced from the inputs given by the civil society not only at home but also in the international arena. For example, civil groups have been pioneer in sparking debates about the so-called Washington Consensus. They have also constantly raised issues pertaining to the ecological imbalances, made qualitative assessments of poverty, and pressurized for the schemes of debt reduction in the South. 4th, transparency of governance. Vigilant civil mobilizations can cause public transparency in governance. Constant pressure from civil society can help in bringing regulatory frameworks and operations into the open, where they could be accessed from public scrutiny. Generally, citizens do not have the awareness about what decisions are taken by the government, by whom, from what options, on what grounds, with what expected results, and with what resources to support implementation. Civil groups, through their well-lit networks, can question and currently popular official rhetoric of transparency by asking critically questions about what is made transparent, at what time, in what forms, through what channels, on whose decision, for what purpose, and in whose interest. Reflections and 2.21.2 What is civil society? What are its functions and in a democracy? 5th, public accountability. Civil society can hold various concerned agencies accountable to public. Civil groups can keep an eye on the implementation and effects of policies regarding people and press for corrective measures when the consequences are adverse. For example, independent civic agencies have partial policy evaluation mechanism for the World Bank and IMF, whereby they have more often criticized their policies towards the less developed countries. The Western countries, which claims to be democratic in the behavior, often while as a part of global players, sometimes become far more dictatorial than more those whom they criticize and put sanctions against them. Here, the civic agencies, through an accountability function, can push authorities in governance to take greater responsibility for their actions and policies. 6. Legitimacy. The sum total of the preceding actions by the civil society could lead to a legitimate democratic rule. The legitimate rule prevails when people concede that an authority has a right to govern and that they have a duty to obey its directives. As a result of such consent, legitimate governance tend to be more easily, productively, and non-violently executed than illegitimate and dictatorial authority. Here it is important to understand that democracy should not be understood only in terms of national governance. The civil society should have a larger agenda of democracy as a policy of global governance. The civil societies not only could promote democracy at home, their impact could be clearly seen in the democratization of global order. Civil society can offer a means for citizens to affirm that global governance arrangements should guide and, where necessary, constrain their behavior. Apart from this, the international concerns for the human rights, women rights, rights of the disabled, and concern for the environment have greater impact in the domestic policy formulation and its implementation too. For example, various development-related NGOs and think tanks who lobby for global debt relief and socially sustainable structural adjustment have gone on to scrutinize public finances in national and local governments. In addition to this, women's movements have often used international laws and institutions in their favor to democratize the state on gender lines. The right of the persons with disability also get impetus from international concerns for human rights. 21.8 The democratic dangers of civil society. Civil society's contribution to democracy in democratic as well as global governance is well placed in context. But here it must be noted that the civil societies might in certain ways actually detract from democratic governance of international relations. In these situations, it is not that civic activities fail to realize their democratizing potential, but that they in fact obstruct popular rule. 7 general negative possibilities can be identified. First, civil society activities may not essentially pursue democratic purposes. Though the term civil society at the outset seems to convey elements of civility and virtue, but in practice, voluntary organizations do not ipso facto have the promotion of democracy on their agenda. On the contrary, elements of such organization may engage themselves in subverting democracy. For example, some civic organizations can work to promote their private petty interest and privileges. The destructive groups engaged in promoting racism, ultranationalism, and religious fundamentalism work contrary to the democratic rights of others. Those part of the Islamic sector that are potentially relevant, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, have not pushed for democracy in a comprehensive fashion. Second, civil society might draw away from democracy if its efforts are poorly planned and designed or executed. If the said activities functions without understanding the institutional arrangement of governance, they could cause real harm to the very objective of their organization. Even academicians may fail to link their theoretical models of universal application of democracy to empirical evidence and political exigencies of that particular area. Third, ill-equipped government agencies cannot handle civil society inputs. Regulatory bodies may lack relevant staff expertise, adequate funds, suitable procedures, or the necessary receptive attitudes to take advantage of the benefits of on offer from civil society. Government officials may consult civic associations only in the later stages of policy making when the key decisions have already been taken. Instead of promoting democracy, this could lead to friction in society and cause turmoil. Fourth, the state funding and benefits could corrupt the volunteers of the civic organization. Instead of focusing on their aims and objectives, they could run into short-term gains. Fifth, inadequate representation could seriously undermine the very fabric of democracy. If civil society have to realize its promises fully, then all the strata of civil society should be duly allowed to access authorities and moreover equally of opportunity in terms of participation. Otherwise, civil society can reproduce or even enlarge structural inequalities and arbitrary privileges connected with class, gender, nationality, race, religion, urban versus rural location, and so on. Sixth, civil society concern for global democracy could be insensitive towards local and cultural practices. Here, civil society may not respond to all of the contexts of local population. In particular, there is a danger that the civil society in the South and the foremost communist-ruled countries could come under the strong influence of Western-style, Western-funded NGOs led by the Westernized. Such campaigns might criticize prevailing conditions of global governance. They have stronger cultural affinities with global managers than with the local communities. Thus, NGOs and other professionalized civil society bodies may perhaps unintentionally marginalize grassroots circles, and that could give better voice to the diverse life worlds and global governance effects. 7. Civil society may lack international democracy. Civil society groups, including those that specially campaign for greater democracy, can fall short of democratic behavior in their own functioning. A lack of international democracy within civil society circle is not only objectionable in itself, but also contradicts its very goal of bringing democracy to society at large. It is an often realized situation where civic associations offer their members little opportunity for participation beyond the payment of subscriptions. Civil society organizations may not advocate on behalf of certain constituencies without adequately consulting them. The leadership of civil association may suppress debate in the name of welfare. Civic groups may lack transparency, as sometimes they do not push financial statements or declaration of objectives of their organization, let alone fulfill scale reports of their activities. Given these potential problems, we should balance our enthusiasm for civil society as promoting agency and democracy in democratic as well as international arena with due caution and care. One should not be swayed by much of the alluring fantasies with the civil societies. Much can do right, but much can also go wrong. Civil society can be a means to good ends, but it is not the end itself. There are circumstances where civic involvement may detract from the democracy or sabotage the very fabric of democracy. It should be the first demand of the society that civic associations should not merely assert but also demonstrate their democratic legitimacy. Reflections and actions in 21.2. What is the relationship between civil society and democracy? In addition to this, it should be clearly inferred that those who propagate or fund the very institution of democracy abroad are themselves democratic in their behavior. US has aided several pro-democratic organizations in the Middle East since 1991. Majority of democracy aid from the Middle East from 1991 to 2000 had been around $150 billion. The projects were classified as civil society strengthening. In West Bank and Gaza, the United States had funded some Palestinian NGOs during the Israeli occupation. After the Palestinian Authority was declared in 1994, the United States expanded their aid and categorized much of it as a civil society strengthening. In 2000, US aid programs launched a $32 million project to support Palestinian NGOs, mostly service NGOs. In Lebanon, US aid program spent several $1 million to assist community-based service NGOs during 90s. Aiding civil society was the leading element of US efforts. Promoting democracy was not the only rationale for these projects. In Egypt, the United States believed that the giving private groups as an expanded role in the development would advance its larger policy goal of economic liberalization. In the West Bank and Gaza, the United States hoped to generate a popular support for the Oslo peace process by helping Palestinian NGOs improve living conditions under self-rule. In addition, NGOs are a key instrument for challenging aid because Congress had imposed a ban on direct US funding of the Palestinian Authority. In Lebanon, the United States wanted to help local communities rebuild in the aftermath of civil war, as government agencies were very weak. Community-based organizations and NGOs were better aid partners. During the Clinton administration, political Islam became a factor, though not one that was openly acknowledged. Some US officials saw service NGOs as a potential counterweight to the Islamic charities and other groups that were a major source of grassroots support for Islamist opposition movements, and these officials wanted to direct resources to such groups for this reason. However, when in 1991 and 2003, America attacked small countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, United States commitment for the global democracy by undemocratic means could be easily inferred. America's liking for democracy is not new. Nearly 24 military invasions launched in the name of democracy throughout Mexico, Central America, and Caribbean by American presidents, most notably Wilson, president in 1913 to 21, did not produce a single viable democracy. More instructive still are the most recent instances in which the United States have forcibly removed dictatorial regimes with the implicit promise of creating democracy. Panama in 1992, Haiti in 1994, and Afghanistan 2002. None of this experience can be held up as examples of successful democratization. 21.9 Conclusion. After having done an in-depth study of the civil society in relation to the functional and promotional aspect of democracy, both at national and international level, we come across a jumbled up institutions that those who always propagate democracy as the best and universal system of governance themselves detract from the same while coming to their own interest, even sometimes petty interest. Still, there cannot be 2 points on the issue that civil society has largely helped to give convenient path to the functioning of democracy. But the general perception that less developed world should accept is that Western model of civil society and democracy is equally dangerous and self-imposing. There is so much of academic assertions on this point that some anthropologists even question whether the concept of civil society even applies outside the West. In a comparative study of China and Taiwan, for example, Robert P. Willis writes, "Have studiously avoided the term civil society while writing about many of its core issues. The term civil society comes with a set of problematic theoretical assumptions and historical connotations which have a strong root in a particular European philosophical tradition." Political theorists Sudipta Kaviraj and Sunil Khilani offer a more explanatory reason for the advent of the concept of civil society. With the arrival of European colonialism, the state became an undeniable, unavoidable part of the business of social living, and the institutional organization of the modern state invites a discourse in terms of a state-civil society distinction. However, they largely try to unfold the debate regarding the advent of civil society and state in the colonial context. To further evaluate the subject in more theoretical context, the following points could be of use for understanding the existing complexity in subject. Firstly, advocates often depict civil society as wholly possible, even flawless. For example, in an article, Civil Society and Building Democracy, Lessons from International Donor Experience, Harry Blair says that civil society organizations increase citizens' participation in the policy-making process, enhance the state accountability to its citizenry, and provide civic educations in democratic politics. This describes an ideal that since 1989 has helped motivate hundreds of millions of dollars in international grants to civil society organizations in less developed countries with mixed result. Secondly, those who idealize civil society often talk about citizen engagement without monitoring citizen conflicts. Yet, conflict over resources, laws, and policies influence is central and inherent to the plurality of interest is at the heart of civil society. For this reason, fundamentalist societies that believe in a single source of truth, such as the Soviet Union under Stalin and other communist countries in the later part of 20th century, or Iran under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini, are much less tolerant of civil society than societies that welcome plural points of view. Third, for decades onward, Westerners have generally placed individualism at the heart of civil society. Ernest, for example, describes the building block of civil society as a modular man, an individual who is autonomous yet willing and able to associate. In much of the world, however, individuals do not consider themselves modular. They regard their identities as members of particular communities determined by family, religion, ethnicity, caste, race, or something else as fundamental, not choices easily made and unmade. For example, in Sakete Center, Muslims, Christians, and worshippers of local gods live together, and Muslims and Christians often sacrifice to local gods when facing particularly vexing problems. Yet this openness to different practices do not mean that individuals are modular and can easily exchange one's faith to another. Religion, like family and ethnicity, embedded the individuals in a web of social connection and cultural members that can be severed only at significant cost. The basic thesis of civil society rests within the presumption that man being social is challenged. If individuals are considered modular, how do we fashion a definition of civil society that works transnationally? For the concept of civil society is placed in two broad parameters. Some have argued that civil society consists of all forms of non-state organization other than the family, which is unacceptable proportion because it's individuals within civil society many social forms that are essentially private and thereby fails to distinguish civil society from society at large. To make the concept more useful for the purpose, civil aspect of civil society must be limit the category to those networks, movements, and organizations that have a public dimension. Fifthly, here it is stressed that civil society is essentially twofold in nature: private in origins but public in focus. Civil society groups represent private interest by employing more often non-violent public means such as association, education, and demonstration to influence policy and polity, whether it is at the neighborhood, city, national, state, or national level. The interest pursued can be individualistic or they can be oriented towards religion, race, and or other social groupings in a way that might generate pressure on government. To conclude our discussion on civil society with a positive academic note, the essential idea that have been put into practice is that democracy requires a healthy and an active civil society. The international community, by providing resources and training to different civic groups, can help to build up domestic civil society in democratizing countries. However, at the same time, caution should be duly taken in imposing one's ideas and culture in the name of civil society or a matter of fact of democracy. Through democracy is one of the highest system of governance both in domestic and international arena, yet there is no final word in social sciences. There are so many ancient cultural systems and practices in the East which are far better than the existing Western way of life. They should not be discarded merely because we have fantasies and fondness for the West. More importantly, the debate and the enthusiasm for promoting better lifestyle should continue in order to benefit the people who are living in authoritarian societies with abysmal poverty and sufferings. 21.10 Further reading. Harry Blair, Civil Society and Building Democracy, Lessons from the International Donor Experience. Page number 6518, Bernard Hellich and Lenning's Civil Society and International Development, North-South Center of the Council of Europe, Development Center of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, 1998. Sudipta Kaviraj and Sunil Khilanani, Introduction Ideas of Civil Society in Civil Society History and Possibilities. And the other one is Cosmopolitan Democracy, an Agenda for New World Order. The other one is Models of Democracy. Then Civil Society in Historical Context, Civil Society Democratization and Development, Clearing and the Analytical Ground Democratization, Volume 1, Number 3, like that. Neera Chantotke, The Civil and the Political in Civil Society Democratization. These are few readings, and this is the end of the Unit 21, named Civil Society and Democracy. Thank you very much.